Welcome to the Korea Society and this afternoon's program, North Korean Human Rights. I'm Tom Byrne, President of the Korea Society. Today we welcome Sophia University professor and Harvard Law School visiting professor, Sandra Fahy. She is the author of Dying for Rights, published by Columbia University Press. We also welcome back Fletcher School professor, Sung-yoon Lee, who authored the review of Sandra's book for the University of Hawaii Journal, Korean Studies. The Korea Society has hosted numerous programs on this topic since the 2014 release of the United Nations Commission of Inquiry report on the human rights situation in North Korea. And just a couple of days ago, the Society hosted UN Special Rapporteur, Thomas Ohea Quintana, for one of our in-house roundtable programs on North Korea and human rights. Sandra, welcome, and Sung-yoon, welcome back. And now I turn the screen over to Senior Director Stephen Noerper.
Thank you, Tom. And thank you all for joining. We're delighted to have you here today. Thank you, Sandra, and thank you, Yun, for your time. And we'd like to thank all 265 of you who RSVP'd for this important dialogue today. And special thanks as well to those who did a shout out via social media. Of course, Jonathan Corrado, who leads the Korea Society campaign, as well as to Do Young Kim, Anna Fifield, and many others who are active in recommending this program. Let us turn very directly to Sandra Fahy and her remarkable book, which is Dying for Rights. And then we'll bring in Professor Sungyoon Lee to talk a bit about his review and to discuss among the three of us some of these issues. Sandra, welcome. It's an important book. It's important to have out there for general reading. You're a wonderful literary writer, and it's important to have out there for educators and policy readers. And you've begun by separating the book really in two fundamental parts, the crimes and the denials. So if I could turn to you first and ask you to give us something of an overview and some context for those of us who are interested in this book.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. It's my absolute pleasure to be here. And, you know, while I'm a bit nervous to speak about this, you know, as an academic, you write because maybe you're not so comfortable speaking. You hope people will actually read the book. But the topic is so important, so I'm happy to speak on it. So thank you very much for having me. And I'm very grateful to Professor Lee for speaking about the book as well. So let me just tell you first what the aim of the book actually is. The aim is to provide kind of the go-to source on this topic of human rights and North Korea. So how has North Korea responded to human rights violations, but also what kind of human rights violations are happening in the country and how long that has been the case. So as you mentioned, I've broken the book into two categories. I look at the crimes that have been committed, and I also look at the denials. So the scope in terms of the crimes that have been committed looks at violations that North Korea has committed domestically and internationally from the formation of the state up to the present. The book was published in the fall of 2019, and I was able to get in some details from the very start of 2019 as well. I also look at the violations that the state commits to its own citizens, but also foreign nationals internationally, as well as within its borders, its citizens within its borders, but also its citizens when they travel internationally. And also I have to say, I mean, the book would have been much longer. My editor cut it down. We cut about 20,000 words out of the book. And I think in total, it's probably about almost 100,000. So those are the crimes. I'm looking at basically all the crimes against humanity that are identified to have happened inside North Korea. So let me just first say, how do we distinguish what is a crime against humanity? And there are 11 types of human rights violations that would be identified as crimes against humanity. But basically a crime against humanity, whether it be rape, murder, disappearance, imprisonment, or enslavement as examples, have to be happening on a deliberate scale. They have to be systematic, and they have to be causing human suffering or death on a large scale. And that is found to be the case with North Korea. Also, as I identify in the book, North Korea commits human rights violations that are of the socioeconomic and political variety, but they also commit violations that are toward physical integrity rights violations. So I kind of distinguish those throughout the book. And as I mentioned, this is in the crimes section. But then I had to go a bit further when I was doing the analysis, because as I was writing the book, which was from 2015 until 2018, North Korea was responding to allegations of its rights abuses fairly systematically on very powerful platforms, through YouTube, through their own channels, through Facebook, all different kinds of platforms, as well as at the United Nations, and sending different delegates to speak at events like side panels, for instance, at the United Nations, the Center for Foreign Relations, I believe it's called, held an event as well. So North Korea was really amping up its response to allegations of rights violations. I just want to say that this is interesting that North Korea did that, because when the Commission of Inquiry was founded by the United Nations, when it was set up in 2013, North Korea was repeatedly invited to participate with the investigation. Several times they were invited to investigate and to participate with the investigation, and North Korea simply ignored the letters, the requests for access to North Korea's territory, to investigate about the political prison camps, etc. North Korea just simply ignored the letters. So then North Korea responded with its denial campaign. That's how they chose to respond to the human rights, the allegations of rights abuses. And further, when the crimes against humanity were found to be the case, systematic at the highest levels of the state, North Korea continued to deny things. So I had to write about that. So I systematically went through all of North Korea's online media, their videos, the state representative speeches at the United Nations, and did a corpus analysis of that. So I used computational software to do an analysis of that. Whenever they talked about human rights, what were they saying and how were they saying it? And so there's some fascinating insights that came about through that. Now, let me just tell you about the argument that I came to at the end of the book after this analysis. And this is really the last thing I want to say, which is that the book makes the following argument, and it's not through opinion, but based on evidence, which is that the crimes against humanity that are happening within North Korea are inelocutable from the state. The state, in other words, needs human rights violations to be happening in order to keep its regime stability. So the violations are intrinsic to the state and they are ongoing. And the response that North Korea has brought to the allegations of and to the findings of crimes against humanity happening within the country have been almost entirely superficial, the responses that they have brought. So that's basically.
Thank you, Professor Fahy. And I would like to get back to a couple of those specifics. Let me bring in Professor Lee, who has authored one of the reviews of the book. Professor Lee, welcome. Nice to have you back at the Korea Society. And was wondering if you would take a minute or two to share some thoughts on your read of the book and the importance that it plays in our dialogue on North Korean human rights.
Well, thank you. Thank you for this opportunity. I had some misgivings before reading the book because you have that monumental study, the UN Commission of Inquiry report on human rights in North Korea that Thomas Byrne mentioned, a 374-page long, the most comprehensive study, legal documentation of this very serious problem, North Korea's manifold crimes against humanity. What book could possibly add more to it? Well, Professor Fahy's book, I have to say, is sui generis. It's unique. What is very impressive about the book throughout is the thoroughly detailed documentation of North Korea's history of human rights violations. The Commission of Inquiry noted, as we know, that the degree, the scale, the nature of North Korea's crimes reveal a state that has no parallel in the contemporary world. The document, that report, did not mention duration. What Professor Fahy does in her book is cover the entire 7 decades long duration history of North Korea's ongoing crimes. But what is more impressive than the documentation of these crimes is that she basically unveils, reveals the nature of the regime. She articulates the ethos, if you will, the essence of the crimes that she dissects, that she analyzes. In Joycean language, the whatness, the very essence of the crimes. Let me try to give you briefly one example. There is a marvelous, a very disturbing, haunting narrative on North Korea's public executions on page 149. Professor Fahy describes the visual, the gruesome scene of the gun being fired, shot at the condemned, the head exploding, the smell of sulfur, the terror-stricken looks on the people who are mostly dragooned into watching this gruesome spectacle. But she notes that the individual executed, along with the witnesses, the public, are simultaneously acted upon, terrorized by the state. And what is left in the wake of the gruesome spectacle, this performative act of violence, is the eradication of any lingering belief among the citizenry that it can, perhaps one day, act against the overwhelming power of the state. And quote, "It is the public, the populace, that is executed," end quote. Basically, that snapshot, that vignette of North Korea's public executions captures the criminal, ruthless, dogged determination by the state to continually terrorize its citizens, to resurrect over and over again death, if you will. The memory, the visual, olfactory, auditory memory of public executions casts a long shadow for the rest of your life. And as we know, even children are dragooned into watching, bearing witness to these horrific scenes. So although, as Professor Fahy notes, one's life can be taken only once, what the state achieves is repeatedly killing and digging up, disinterring the dead in terrorizing the people. So throughout the book, there are many startling metaphors, revelations of North Korea's crimes that are shocking, yet the book also offers hope. In many ways, it's inspiring, and perhaps we'll come back to that later on.
Certainly. Thank you, Yoon. Sandra, if I could get to a few specifics given your opening and reinforced here by Yoon, and that is that, you chose this formula of crimes and then denials. And it was interesting, I would have expected perhaps with the title that you would begin with the camps. And it was actually in the 7th chapter, after you have explained the human rights violations associated with famine and hunger, efforts at information control, control of movements, the everyday realities that Yoon has just spoken to as well, that you get to the issue of the camps and torture and execution, which of all things has probably leapt out. And it's also what surprises those who are new to North Korean human rights to discover that in 2020 and 2021, we have as a reality 120,000 North Korean citizens imprisoned in this gulag. Could you speak a bit to the issue of that? And then we'll move to a question I have for you on denials.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Stephen. And thank you, Professor Lee, for your very eloquent and well, you read the book very carefully, and so any author is always appreciative of that. And Stephen, thank you so much for your question too. The book had to be written in that way. I had to go from I guess we could say banal and quotidian, the ordinary, the structural types of rights violations that we all move through. Of course, North Koreans move through and are quite unaware that their rights are being violated. And of course, as you write something, you draft it, and the drafts were such that I felt that there was a kind of domino effect. So certain rights would be violated, and I mentioned in the book that rights violations occur as a plurality. So you won't ever just have one human right that is violated. You always have several that are violated. And the same in terms of when human rights are respected. You have many that they're contingent on each other. They have to be respected as a plurality in order to come into their full fruition. In the negative way, the same is true for rights violations. So the inability to access enough food, the inability to advocate for yourself, to request or demand more food, or demand more access to food, or as Amatera Sen says, alter your access to food. So to be able to sell things that you need, to be able to change your job or move to a different part of the country. These are things that are all largely criminalized in North Korea. So you have to always be ducking beneath the law within North Korea's, North Korea's system is outside the rule of law. But even though they claim to have laws, these laws you're constantly having to duck beneath because you can't really live and survive according to the law. And so subsequently different rights will be violated and different punishments will be asserted onto the individual. So this is why in the introduction of the book, I discuss an individual who finds himself in a political prison camp. He finds himself experiencing physical integrity rights violations, but he wasn't an individual who just, for instance, as we might imagine, came out and began protesting, or as we see in the streets of some cities today, taking down statues that he disagrees with. No, the man was just cross-border trading with China and trying to get food to sell so that he could build a better livelihood for himself. He had no bone to pick with the state. So, as well in the book, I talk about within the political prison camps, people are baffled as to why they are there. They're unable to understand why they are there. And then in a cruel twist, one of the prison guards who reported that people were telling him, "Oh, I don't know why I'm here," and he judged them. Later, he was in their position and couldn't quite figure out why he was there. So that's why I wrote the book using that kind of structure. The material itself dictated the manner of its telling.
Mm-hmm. And you do a brilliant job of doing that, of addressing the systemic issues. But then you do visit a number of the defectors whom we know, many of whom have spoken at the Korea Society and other places around the United States, two of whom were just elected to South Korea's National Assembly. And you tell their stories in ways that I think provide an intimate but also leveling effect that's very useful for policy readers and educators.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that was my hope.
Good. To move to the denial section, which I found equally as rich and interesting, right? Because it's not Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment. It's the crimes and the denials. And there really hasn't been much written about this response. In particular, when you get to chapter 11, you've written brilliantly on the rhetoric of denial at the United Nations, and keeping in mind that we have a number of people viewing now online from the UN, which is very close to the Korea Society, physically just a few blocks away. I was wondering if you had some thoughts and messages for those who are working within the senior levels of the United Nations on looking at North Korea's rhetoric of denial.
Mm-hmm. Well, at one of these public events, Samantha Power said something which I fully agree with, which is that we have to let North Korea speak and we have to listen to what they have to say. She further said that North Korea itself is self-discrediting, which I would agree with, but also North Korea's production, these representatives who come and speak at the United Nations, the videos that North Korea produces, and they've made, I think, into the hundreds now, documentaries that are slandering defectors. We may appear in one of these documentaries in the future, given what we're talking about now. But those items, I consider them as artifacts that we can examine and that are possibly part of the record. So I encourage those who are working at the UN, as they do, they listen to what North Korea has to say. But I think that there are I'd like to make some key recommendations that whether the UN or different governments could press North Korea to do, simple things that North Korea is not doing, which I think could produce some very interesting movements for us, perhaps in terms of human rights. I could give an example of what those things are if you'd like.
Please, please.
Yes. So when I was doing an analysis of North Korea's denials, well, of course, we had one individual, one state representative who came out of the UN and spoke at, I believe it was the Council on Foreign Relations, excuse me. Unfortunately, at that event, I didn't get the impression, I watched it, I didn't get the impression that many in the audience who had the opportunity to ask questions, I didn't get the impression that they had read the Commission of Inquiry report very thoroughly, nor that they had read North Korea's own human rights report very thoroughly. So it was a bit like, you say in Korean, 안타깝다, like it was sort of a sort of sad regret because they missed an opportunity to really ask the state, because this individual is speaking on behalf of the state. So you in effect almost get to ask Kim Jong-un, why did you inject certain contradictions within the report? For instance, page, I make reference to them in my own book. So that was sort of regrettable. And then in other ways to catch them up in the contradictions or the, we could say, incoherence of certain arguments that North Korea puts forward. So that's one example. So just whoever is listening right now, be sure to read the material because it can provide an excellent door to go through to interrogate and investigate further. The second thing is that I think we need to push North Korea to do live broadcasts. North Korea never does anything live. Everything's pre-recorded and then quadruple checked up and down. Past work is checked, believe it or not. This is both video and print. So I think it would be very interesting to see North Korea pushed to do some live broadcasts. Some other things as well. For instance, I think it would be good for us to push North Korea to speak on the issue of religious freedom. They've spoken about, for instance, overseas workers, and they've allowed Will Ripley to go in and speak with these alleged overseas workers who came back and are now happily reporting that overseas work was great and none of their human rights were violated. I think it would be interesting if we could push, well, you say you have religious freedom according to your constitution. So we would like to go in and speak with some religious leaders, some religious followers, ask them about their prayers, ask them about their relationship with God, etc. So really push North Korea to demonstrate to us the rights that they claim to be protecting and honoring. Those are just a few examples. Of course, the book has many more.
Many more, and one, if I might underscore too, your emphasis on access is really critically important in terms of the ability for the UN Special Rapporteur and others to have access.
Yeah, this is a basic one. And in fact, when anyone brings up the notion of sanctions or sanctions relief, I'm sort of perplexed as to know why we are not pushing North Korea for access to some districts, to some areas. If in fact you want sanctions relief, then perhaps you could give us access to, asking for access to the political prison camps is an intolerable notion for North Korea, because of course you're asking for access to places that don't exist according to North Korea. But for instance, orphanages, certain hospitals, institutes that are alleged to be set aside for people who are disabled, these sorts of things. We're not able to make any kind of on-the-ground access, which is why, again, as I identify in the book, North Korea then tries to give us this, what I call an ersatz civil society, manufactured civil society through video. They try to give us this because they know they can't let us in to see it. Well, they've had humanitarian groups inside, but they're always controlling what they see, whether or not they are able to speak Korean, these types of things.
Thank you, Sandra. I have a last question for you and for Yoon as well, before we turn to our very distinguished audience. And we have a long list of questions that have come in as we've been talking. If I could ask you to put this in the context of today. You alluded to the statues, you've alluded to the protests taking place, and we certainly know in the United States, across Europe, and globally, to include in South Korea, where there's been very active support for Black Lives Matter, that we know that injustice to one is an injustice to all, that anyone's injustice is everyone's injustice. And if you could put the North Korean human rights concerns in that context, and your book in that context, because clearly they echo and reinforce the sentiments that are being expressed at this time.
Yes, so of course, the video of the murder of George Floyd, to whose family I send my condolences. And I mean, it's just, yeah, it's brutal. And of course, I support all of the movements that are going on, and the statue taking down, or the decapitation of statues. I'm following that on Twitter, and I think it's quite interesting. I don't think we're going to be seeing any statues in North Korea being decapitated or being knocked down. Why is that? Maybe people might want to knock them down, but they know that doing so would be the elimination of themselves. And in fact, as we know in North Korea, they practice something called 영처제, which is the belief that somebody inherits their politics the way we inherit our DNA from our family. So you are genetically, politically questionable if you have any ties. So such an individual who would dare to desecrate a statue in North Korea would find him or herself and his family up and down the generations in a political prison camp. You know, North Korea reported on Black Lives Matter, and I tweeted about that, and I said, North Korea, in fact, does not believe that Black lives matter. And I stand by that. And in fact, North Korea's state media also indicates that they don't believe that Black lives matter, which is regrettable. North Korea is interested in operationalizing the movement of Black Lives Matter to drive the point that North Korea is in the position that it is in terms of geopolitical isolation, sanctions, and its horrendous record of human rights violations, clearly amounting to crimes against humanity. North Korea tries to put forward the idea that they are in the position that they are in because of US imperialism and the white police killing of Black men and women in the United States, which is absolutely egregious and absolutely must be investigated by the United Nations. North Korea is operationalizing that for their own purposes. You will recall there's a part in the book where North Korea holds an event in London with an anti-imperialist group. And Tae Young-ho was there, the man who is currently in government in South Korea before he defected. He was speaking at this event, and later he reported on what he said. And, he had to admit that, of course, he was saying everything he was saying because he had to say it. And he knew that what he was saying about healthcare in North Korea, for instance, and the rates of homelessness in the United States, and police violence in the United States, and racist violence in the United States were means to distract from the topic at hand.
Thank you. Professor Lee, would you like to add to Professor Fahy's comments on the contemporary context?
Thank you. Well, there are human rights issues, of course, violations in every country, even in the most advanced democracies of the world. But North Korea is unique in that it is the only country that says, with a straight face, that there are no human rights problems inside North Korea. So this dogged determination to deny that North Korea has any human rights issues is laid bare by Sandra Fahy. For example, the 17,600 Rodong-Sinmun articles that she analyzed breaks new grounds, I would say. Her analysis of North Korea's video broadcasts, state ventriloquism, I think that's the phrase Professor Fahy uses. She sees through all these fake posturing, ordinary so-called North Korean people speaking before the camera. And she notes that this is fake, that the voice is very strange, quote, magically synesthetic, as she notes. It conjures up visual images, and a visual image has a tendency to make the person real or even believable, but the voice is that of a wooden doll, merely repeating the state's message. There is emotional stoicism, I think that's the term you used, in what North Korean citizens are saying before the cameras. So I'm afraid, in a way, Professor Fahy has preempted North Korea from allowing live video conferences after the authorities, if they haven't already read this book, I think they'll be very much more guarded and be unwilling to grant live interviews. But my point here is the second half of the book, the denials in varying forms. This is also unprecedented, this kind of analysis, comprehensive analysis of the many methods and the extent to which North Korea goes to deny its human rights violations. This is revelatory. So I highly recommend that you read the entire book from the very beginning to the very end, because the book is a continual series of epiphanies.
Sandra, you end the book with messages in bottles, or message in a bottle, another very literary way to draw to a close. Could you offer us a bit of insight or summary on that?
Mm-hmm. So, the book is, by the way, you might be able to hear my cat, sorry about that. The book is, I was just aware that for the reader, it's probably quite harrowing. It's difficult for me to imagine what the book would be like for a reader. Having written it, I don't know, but I've worked on this subject, I've researched this topic for now nearly 20 years. And as I open the book, I'm talking with a North Korean defector, and I'm talking about how doing the research has been, well, it's depressing, it's enraging. I had many times when I had to call fellow friends who are activists and scholars working in this field, because I was I was crying, of course, reading this material, enraged. And of course, at the beginning of the book, he says to me, well, Sandra, you only have to research it. We had to live that, and he's sort of chiding me and making fun of me. And he's right. I've never had to live that. So the book is sort of framed in that way. I open with that scene where we're going to the DMZ's kind of watery border, and we're going to send rice bottles into North Korea. You can see some of the pictures there. I had done a video with David Kong at USC, and they paid me an honorarium, and I changed all the money, the bills, into $1 bills, and we were sending them all into North Korea with the rice and with USBs and with medication for stomach worms. And yeah, we were sending them off. And it was a great experience to be doing that with defectors. And it's precisely the thing that the Moon administration is blocking North Korean defectors and South Korean citizens. Of course, North Korean defectors are South Korean citizens now, but denying them the ability to do. But the point I'm making at the end with our messages in the bottle is that for me, I see one of the primary ways, the thing which has perhaps driven the greatest change in terms of the lives of North Korean people where rights are concerned, is in terms of the activist network that has built up as a result of defectors. There are 30,000 of them in South Korea, as we know, many more in China who can't really be active overtly, have to be clandestine because of China's laws. These individuals are keeping contact with family back in the North, sending money, sending resources, enabling them to make a kind of chain defection out of the country. But they're also developing activist networks, sharing information with us, letting us know what's happening on the ground in real time in North Korea. So when I end the book with this act of, for myself, a scholar in the field, doing something, taking what I've dedicated my life to, and trying to reach out to people who I cannot help directly. It's sort of my call to any reader who might be reading it to know that this is a way, as I say in the book, to dip beneath the controls of the state of North Korea and South Korea and connect with our fellows to help them.
Thank you, Sandra. Thank you for that.
May I just add, Professor Fahy very appropriately, admirably, dedicates her book to the North Korean people, as she put it, to those who live and die under the system the book describes. And that's where I have an irreconcilable difference with Professor Fahy. It should be, she dedicates the book to those who live and die under the system she illuminates. She really reveals the nature of the North Korean system in this marvelous book.
Thank you, Yun. And Sandra, thank you for that, for both this tale and for a very important work, which I do hope sees many classrooms as well as a wide readership. The book is available through Columbia University Press. There's information on our webpage for this event in terms of how people can access that, or certainly seek it out through Amazon or their better booksellers. It is part of the Contemporary Asia in the World series, which is coordinated by our good friends David Kong at USC, as you mentioned, and Victor Cha at Georgetown and CSIS, who have a very distinguished series up and available with a number of works. So Sandra, thank you. Good luck with this. And let us turn now to our very distinguished audience who may have questions for Professor Sandra Fahy or for Professor Sung-yoon Lee. And Jonathan Corrado of our team at the Korea Society will jump in. He has been receiving those as the program has progressed.
Thank you very much, Dr. Noerper, and thank you, Dr. Fahy and Dr. Lee. Wonderful presentation, and we've been getting a lot of engagement, as Stephen mentioned. We always love to get this sort of interactivity from our audience, and we're looking forward to conveying that to you. Before I ask a question, I first want to convey a compliment, and that comes from a viewer. She's a defector named Ji-hyun Park, who lives in the UK. And she would like to thank you for writing a book that has such tremendous detail, and wonders perhaps about your utilization of Korean language sources, which must have been the way that you've been able to capture such detail.
Thank you. So do you want me to speak on this issue, or?
Sure, yeah.
So I moved to Korea in 2001 to learn Korean and to collect oral histories from North Koreans who survived the famine. And I knew that learning Korean would be one of the only ways that I was going to be able to do this research. Of course, you can imagine it's a very difficult language, learning it as an adult, etc. You know, Korean is such an interesting language. Of course, all languages are interesting, but what I love about Korean is you have this ability to alter a syllable here or there, and you can amplify a critique. So I describe it as this little like linguistic suitcase that you open up, and it tells this whole other story about what's going on. And for me, I really encourage any researchers or anybody who may be listening, as much as possible, work in Korean or work with a translator, and listen very carefully to the way North Koreans speak. And this is one of the things that I explored a lot in my first book, was to ask them about self-talk, how they spoke to themselves in their own head, like athletes do this. Well, we all do this. So I asked them to clarify those points, and because it lets you know not only about the external world of North Korea, but the inner world that people were experiencing. And also I asked them things like about reported speech. I asked them about the role of humor in North Korea. I don't know if you guys recall, there are some jokes that are inserted in this book, some which are very problematic, but that are from North Korea and tell us a lot about conditions on the ground. So, of course, I did all the research with North Korean language material in English and in Korean. All the videos are in Korean, with some, I think, have subtitles in English. And as Professor Lee will know, North Korea is very rich in its descriptions of things that they love and things that they detest. And I'm here speaking mostly about the state rhetoric.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fahy. And I certainly empathize with that journey, that long journey to learn Korean as a Korean language learner myself. And the Korea Society is happy to offer Korean language courses now. Of course, they're all online, but we encourage people to sign up for that, and our summer session is just underway. I want to turn to a question from Jack Rendler. He's the North Korea country specialist for Amnesty International USA. Jack asks, what's your advice to human rights groups such as Amnesty International for working on North Korea?
Wow, that's amazing. Thank you for that question. Well, please reach out to me. I'm happy to offer you any kind of help you need. Amnesty International, it would be my honor. And there's a few key things that in terms of activism, I mean, as I see it, there's communities of activists that are doing work that is problematic in terms of national laws. I mean, clearly we can see that in terms of how Moon has responded to the activists in South Korea now by saying that they can't send the rice bottles in, they can't send the balloons in. But there are other groups such as Rimjingang. I'm going to put up a poster later that has some organizations that are listed. And if Amnesty International isn't already in touch with them, I would encourage you to reach out to them. I'm sure you're in touch with most of them. But I think one thing we need to do, whether it's Amnesty or other groups, is activists need to continue to put efforts into enabling North Koreans to enjoy their own samizdat. As I identify in the book, North Koreans have not seen media made by North Koreans for North Koreans ever. And the ability to enjoy or consume your own media that you make, that your people distribute, is absolutely key. Now, some of you might think that's absolutely preposterous idea, but if you look at the group Asia Press and their kind of subsidiary Rimjingang, they are working with clandestine journalists inside North Korea to collect information on the ground. So for instance, when Kim Jong-nam was murdered, the markets were discussing who this individual was, what had happened, all this kind of stuff. And so we were able to understand what was going on within the markets. But that information needs to be anonymized, the voices altered, and put onto USBs and sent back into North Korea, so that North Koreans in Cheongjin can know that North Koreans in Pyongyang are also perhaps mystified by certain things that are reported in the news, but they know that the news in North Korea doesn't tell everything. They could see how North Koreans in Pyongyang are interpreting the price of rice and other things like that, that we learn about, because that information is being brought out. but we need to, as I said, anonymize it and send it back in the same way we're sending in the South Korean movies, the American movies, the Japanese, etc.
Please refer to pages 95 to 96 in the book.
Yes, thank you, Yoon. Thank you for that. But also, I would just say, I mean, perhaps I need to be a little bit more specific. With Amnesty, I would encourage them to press for access. And Amnesty actually was the first one to break the story of, I believe it was Setalot. I'm forgetting the names. Professor Lee will remember them. He has an encyclopedic memory. But Amnesty has done incredible work. And so anyway, please reach out. I'm happy to help you. Perhaps, yes, I can provide more details then.
Thank you. Wonderful. Let's move along to the next one, which is from Emma Chandler Avery. She works at the Congressional Research Service. And her question is about the Special Envoy for Human Rights. She asks, has the Trump administration's elimination of the Special Envoy for Human Rights made a difference in terms of the DPRK's treatment of the issue? And this is for everyone, including Dr. Fahy, Dr. Lee, Dr. Noerper.
Well, perhaps I will let you and Professor Lee first, if you wish to address that. Maybe the audience needs a little bit of a break from my own voice. I don't know.
Well, very briefly, President Trump gave by far the most eloquent, heartfelt speech on the human rights situation in North Korea of any US president or any South Korean president. In fact, no South Korean president has spoken on this issue in public. This was in November 2017 during President Trump's visit to South Korea and neighboring countries. The entire speech was about human rights, the ongoing crimes in North Korea. It was a marvelous speech, which excited the human rights community. It was an inkling that human rights would be at the forefront of US policy toward North Korea. A few months later, as many of you might recall, during the State of the Union address, President Trump invited Ji Sung-ho and also Mr. and Mrs. Warmbier, the parents of Otto Warmbier. However, the moment that North Korea reached out to President Trump, propositioning Trump for a summit meeting, all that faded. And as we recall, in the wake of the summit with Kim Jong-un in June in Singapore 2018, during the press conference, President Trump gave a very unfortunate answer to a question by a Washington Post reporter, what about human rights? President Trump said, well, it's rough over there, but it's rough in a lot of other places too. So the fact that no special envoy for human rights in North Korea has been appointed to this day sends the wrong message to North Korea. It reaffirms basically what much of the world knows, that human rights is viewed as perhaps even a nuisance, an impediment to progress on the diplomatic front, and that's a shame.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. Any other thoughts on that one?
Well, I would just add that it's, I can only imagine that North Korea responded with glee when when Trump said it's rough and it's rough in a lot of places, and as an answer to the Washington Post journalist, because Trump had just said, oh yes, we talked a lot about rights. We talked about a lot of things. Yeah, so it would have thrilled North Korea to hear him say that, because this is an argument that North Korea gives all the time, which is you can't critique rights in one part of the world if they're occurring in some other part of the world, which is absolutely illogical and distracts from the case at hand.
Thanks so much. Okay, I'm going to start to bunch our questions up together because we have gotten so many. So I ask for our audience members' forgiveness as I paraphrase their questions now. A group of questions that we got about recent developments in terms of the leafletting and defector activism in South Korea and the South Korean government's response. This comes to us from Liz Kim from the Voice of America and from Greg Scarlato, who's the executive director for the Committee for Human Rights in North Korea. So they both want to know a little bit more about this dynamic, the government response, what it means going forward.
Well, for me, and I mentioned this on Twitter, that what North Korea fears is the truth that is carried in many of these leaflets and the bottles with the USBs and the information that's coming through with them. Many defectors describe truth or information as a kind of nuclear weapon to the North Korean regime. And they see it as absolutely hostile. It is impossible that leaflets could be such a threat to the regime unless the information therein is what they don't want. I mean, North Korea doesn't fear information, they just fear the truth. And that's what's coming through to them. So that is what is the problem. And the fact that the Moon regime is bowing to the wishes of Kim Jong-un and Kim Yo-jong must make them react with such glee as well. And in fact, the Moon administration is violating the rights of these individuals by not permitting them to express themselves freely. A good friend of mine, Henry Hyun Song, has said that many of these groups have had their status in the country reduced. And some of these groups are only working to provide education to North Korean young defectors to learn English and to develop other skills, which they are often falling behind in because of their experience defecting from North Korea and possibly being gochebi orphans in North Korea and their journey out. I think Professor Lee will kind of nicely elaborate a bit more on this too. I'd love to hear what he has to say.
The unfortunate reality is various South Korean administrations predating the current Moon administration, including conservative so-called administrations under Park Geun-hye and Lee Myung-bak and others, have not been very forthcoming, have tended to view these efforts to disseminate information into North Korea as an impediment to diplomacy, to North-South negotiations. And the reason that this message resonates, the reason that over 50% of the South Korean people actually tend to view these efforts by activists as an impediment, is because of the lack of general education on North Korea in general, and in particular, human rights situation in North Korea, in South Korean schools. So the underlying insouciance, the apathy that we see on the part of the South Korean populace at large toward North Korea's human rights violations, unfortunately, is a systemic problem that probably will not be resolved anytime soon. And whenever the government in Seoul cracks down on these activities, the majority of the South Korean population will support that unfortunate decision.
Sandra, do you know, is the book available in Korean language, or are you planning to release it in Korean?
No, it's not, and Columbia hasn't discussed that. I think it would be wonderful if we could. There's no plan to have that happen yet.
Thank you, Jonathan. Do we have another question?
Yes, we do. This is another paired question from two people who are asking about an elaboration of something that Dr. Lee mentioned earlier, which is the relationship between human rights considerations and nuclear negotiations. So the question is, should human rights concerns be put aside in order to make progress in nuclear negotiations? And then the corollary would be, if not, how might we include them in an engagement effort that also includes pursuing progress on denuclearization?
Professor Lee, I believe the question is to you.
Oh, I defer to you. This is your session.
You know, I've here at Harvard, I sat next to a government official who apologized to me and said that, you know, I'm really sorry, but the human rights issue is in no way as critical as and as important as the nuclear issue. Yeah, I mean, it doesn't mean, doesn't have to be a zero-sum game. I think we can work on both of these things together. Although it's important for the audience to know that North Korea sees this critique of its human rights as another manifestation of the critique of its nuclear power. So whatever critique is leveled toward North Korea, it interprets as an aim to destroy the country. So I'll just say that first. And then secondly, I have heard, and I agree, that one of the primary reasons that, well, a significant reason why North Korea has developed nuclear weapons is so that no other country would invade North Korea. So let's imagine there was an interest in invading and toppling the regime in North Korea. Well, the fact that there are nuclear weapons would deter such a thing. But also that enables North Korea to not fear that the issue of human rights will be taken seriously. I do think that the cumulative effect of human rights violations in North Korea, because we know the impact of these things is generational. For instance, women in the first and third trimester who suffer with food shortages are more likely to give birth to children who have issues later in terms of their mental health, schizophrenia, higher rates of cancer, things like this, stunting. Children's education. There's all kinds of issues that have a knock-on effect. And while it might not seem as immediate as a nuclear threat, eventually the day of reckoning will come. And I think it is important for these to be identified as equally significant.
May I just add to that quickly?
Yes,
to amplify on Professor Fahy's point in the book, the very basic message in North Korea's denials of human rights is one based on so-called cultural relativism, that human rights, this is essentially a concoction by the Western imperialists, the United States, and that the US is using the human rights racket, so-called, to topple the DPRK. Invasion did not work because North Korea developed a bomb. Sanctions did not work. Well, that's because they've never been really enforced in full. But now the United States is trying to bring down the system with the human rights racket. So for the United States or other countries to self-deter, to play into that North Korean narrative and believe that if we raise human rights, we'll make no progress on other diplomatic issues. This is self-deterrence, it's self-hypnosis. The United States during the Cold War raised human rights vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, even as it was negotiating with the Soviets on disarmament issues. The two can take place at the same time. Diplomacy and human rights.
Thank you.
I just want to add
Sandra,
something that's interesting. There was an interesting report about megatons for megawatts, where if North Korea is in fact identifying as energy poor, then they could trade some of these items to the United States, for instance, in terms of energy, and get energy back. I mean, this was an agreement that was made between Russia and the United States. So yeah, you can really see that the arguments that North Korea makes are hollow.
Thank you. And I might add that for those of you interested in this question of the balance of human rights and denuclearization emphases, Victor Cha has done a report for the Bush Institute that was released a little over a month ago. And our last installment on human rights was on that release. So we'd encourage you to access either the YouTube or the audio podcast on that. Sandra, thank you very much for this. And Sungyoon Lee, thank you as well. It has been an important conversation about a critical issue at really a critical time in our nation and in our world, where there are enhanced calls for social justice. And Sandra, thank you also for highlighting both in the work and in your comments today the important work of others who have contributed, Greg Scarlett and HRNK among them in our questions today, and for those who hold the affirming flame for human rights in North Korea. Your book is very moving, and I know it will move my students at Columbia University, and I hope nationally and internationally as well. And it would be wonderful to see it in Korean. Many of my Korean students are very enthusiastic about the issue of North Korean human rights, and I hope that helps to contribute. Any final thoughts, Sandra, as we prepare to depart for the weekend?
Yeah, Stephen, thank you so much. Professor Lee, Jonathan, Thomas, Peter, everybody, audience, thank you so much. I wouldn't want to just leave you with this and not give you information of where to go further. So I've just offered a little screenshot of some organizations. I sent it to Jonathan. He's going to share his screen, hopefully, and it should be there for you to see. I neglected to add Liberty in North Korea is an organization that I encourage you to contact. Oh, thank you for laying it out more beautifully, Jonathan. Thank you. And please feel free to just take a photograph of some of these, this page, and get in touch with these organizations if you'd like to do more work in terms of the topics we've been speaking about. So thank you so much.
Sandra, thank you for sharing your list, and thank you really for delightful work that is so critically important. I'd also like to point out as we close that Ambassador Kathy Stevens, the chairwoman of the Korea Society, President Tom Byrne have a statement up at koreasociety.org on reflections on the current issues of justice and human rights. And we'd ask you to go to koreasociety.org to see that. And of course, if you're not a member of the Korea Society, please do consider joining at koreasociety.org. For those of you interested in arts and culture and educational opportunities, we have a rich array. We had an important program this morning on coronavirus in Korea, part of a continuing series. We have a wealth of offerings on the arts and culture front with a culinary aspect taking place this week. So do look at koreasociety.org for the array of programs being offered. Professor Sandra Fahy, Professor Sung-yoon Lee, thank you. And Sandra, for Dying for Rights, thank you. Good luck with this release. And we look forward to progress in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you all for joining.